Hi, folks. Thank you all for joining us. We are getting started here. I see the attendee list is populating, so I'll hang back just a couple minutes to see if that keeps growing.
You're live.
And I'll take, I should take this opportunity to remind the attendees as we go that please feel free to submit your questions via text. Those will be handled by the kind folks at Noble, so we get a sense of what you guys are asking, and I can pass those on at the end of the session to the panelists here. All right, great. I see the trickle is slowing down a bit, so it looks like we can probably go ahead and get started here. All right, so yeah, thanks again to everyone who joined us today. Thank you to the attendees. Thank you to my esteemed panel. We are looking forward to a very lively and enlightening conversations. I'll be introducing those folks momentarily. Thanks to Noble and thanks to President Linda Williams, and thank you to all our kind sponsors and partners here, including not the least of which as my own employer, Thomson Reuters. My name is Hassan Kanu. I'm a columnist at Thomson Reuters. I write a column called Justice Matters. And many of you, maybe not all, but many of you at least will be happy to hear that I do write about law enforcement, including local agencies, local police departments, and at the federal level at DOJ and FBI and so forth constantly. And so, like I said, we're looking forward to a very enlightening conversation here about the alarming rise in extremist violence and hate crimes that we're seeing around the United States currently. And so before I get to introducing our panelists here, I just want to lay some things down on the table, just some background facts to kind of keep in mind as we have the conversation. And certainly the panel is quite familiar with the information I'm relaying here, but maybe some of the attendees are not so well versed on this kind of stuff. And certainly members of the public will be able to view this later. So just as a matter of background, you know, one of the things that I think about and sort of always mention when I'm writing about this subject, or, you know, anyone who's kind enough to lend me an ear at a bar or wherever else we are, if this subject comes up, is I always like to point out the fact that when we talk about this subject, that a lot of this ties back, of course, to the era of lynching in the United States, right? Certainly the nomenclature has changed into how we refer to this type of violent crime, but lynching and the information we have about those crimes before the 1950s and a bit past, actually, those crimes are quite similar to what we talk about today when we talk about hate crimes, if not the same exact thing. And a couple of specific cases I like to mention to folks is if you think about cases of Ahmaud Arbery and Trayvon Martin, right? These are cases we're all familiar with. If you think about sort of the fact pattern in how those incidents and crimes played out, there are striking parallels to lynchings that happened before the 1950s in America, right? Just in terms of how the crime happened, what the motivation was, what the result was, whether the person was prosecuted or not. Again, those two cases, Ahmaud Arbery and Trayvon Martin, if you look at the fact pattern and look at fact patterns of crimes in the past era of lynching, you'll find that, again, as I said, very, very striking, same category of crime. So these are things that are still happening today. And of course, we are Noble, so it bears mentioning certainly hate crimes and bias motivated crimes against people of color and Black folks in particular. But of course, we have, for example, on the panel here, we have Cynthia Dietl, who's at Facebook and used to be at the Matthew Shepard Foundation. We all know that name because of a horrific hate crime that was committed against a young LGBTQ man several years back, right? Nowadays, when the subject comes up, everyone thinks about Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, right? That's who's been a more notable target of these crimes more recently, especially since the onset of the coronavirus and the sort of rhetoric that was exacerbated by former President Donald Trump. Of course, there are other populations too to discuss, right? We have there are bits of news that came out in the past few weeks I'd also like to put on the table. One of those is a government study that found that the Department of Justice has declined to prosecute about 82% of hate crimes, right, over the past, since 2005 or so. So that's the large bulk of reported hate crimes to the federal government that went without prosecution. By way of comparison, for other categories of federal crime, the rate of non-prosecution was 13%. So 13% versus 82%. We also know that consistently for the past several years, over 80%, actually more than likely goes back much further than that, but definitely for the past several years, since at least 2017, over 80% of law enforcement agencies have been reporting zero bias-motivated crimes to federal agencies, right? And that certainly seems like a statistical impossibility. And again, as I said, just in the past few weeks, we've had what appears to be, at least the Boston Herald is reporting this, the case of Genko. I might be mispronouncing his name there. I've only read it and not heard it said out loud. But that case appears to be the first ever federal hate crime prosecution based on the victims being female, right? And that's in 2021. 3 or 4 years back, we had the first ever federal hate crime prosecution based on the victim being a transgender person. And we know that that minority population has been the victim of violence for a very, very long time, right? So, those are sort of the background facts that I want to put on the table before we get started here. And I'll start off introducing, as I said, our esteemed panelists. We've got folks here from government, private sector, and law enforcement. And I think we'll have a very great conversation here. So I'm going to introduce our panelists one by one and let them say just a couple words by way of introduction, and then we'll get into it. And so first, we've got Jerica Richardson. She's Senior Vice President of Equitable Justice at National Urban League. Jerica, how are you?
I'm well. Thank you, Hassan, and thank you to President Williams and Noble for including me in today's conversation with this incredible group of leaders. As you mentioned, I'm Jerica Richardson. I'm the Senior Vice President for Equitable Justice and Strategic Initiatives at the National Urban League. It is one of the nation's largest and oldest civil rights organizations. And as we all know all too well, the rise in hate crimes in this country is astronomical. And the fight for equity and justice in combating hate is a continual one, and it's exactly why my division was founded. We work in coalition with other affinity groups and other civil rights organizations because we understand that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We also recognize that the laws authorizing government to respond to hate crimes are the direct result of the fight for civil rights. So make no mistake, domestic terror groups steeped in racial and religious and hate and other areas have a long history in this country. All we have to do is look at the KKK and just the history that you laid out earlier, Hassan. And it's just critical that we work with all of our law enforcement and government bodies to really leverage our resources to influence public policy, to build momentum on the ground, and really to bring people together to eradicate hate.
Thank you, Jerica. And next we've got Greg Erie. Greg is Vice President of Law Enforcement Analysis at the Anti-Defamation League. Greg, how are you?
I'm fine, Hassan. Thank you for having me. I'm going to echo what my colleague Jerica said. Thank you so much for having us. Noble, it's a great partnership, and have been working very closely with Mr. Crawford and some of the people you see on this screen. The sad part of this is I wish we didn't have to have this conversation, but the important part is that we are having it. Too often people try to shy away from these subjects, and it doesn't give us any progress in it. Here at the ADL, much like, again, the Urban League we work very closely with, we've been studying extremism for years, over 100 years of our existence. In a former life, I was with the FBI, and I see two of my colleagues, Jay and Cynthia, who are on today to join this discussion. The simple facts are just that, simple. If you look at the statistics and what we have, the best statistics we can derive from are from 2019, where the one that stands out in my mind is we had over 100% increase in hate crime related murders. And if you take that, those numbers, that is obviously trending the wrong way. And it's a horrendous statistic. The sad part, even sadder part about that is, as was mentioned, we don't know if this is the accurate number. We certainly know it's not going to get better as we get a more accurate picture. It's going to move up. And what's driving this? Because we certainly can't go year to year with 100% over and over again. And as you pointed out, Hassan, it's starting to see there were what I'll call, and not happily, the traditional hate crimes that we looked at throughout our controversial history in this country. But we're expanding it to the transgender community, to the ethnic communities across the board. So these are two things I'd really like to dig into. And I think the solution, I'm certainly not going to jump ahead of ourselves, is what you see formed by this panel. It has to be a collaborative relationship between the government, between law enforcement, between organizations like Noble, along with the private sector partnerships that we have to identify and then work and come up with a solution on how we're going to press forward as a country. But it's something that has to be addressed. I won't take up any more time because I'm looking forward to hearing from the other panelists and participating here. But thank you again for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. And you mentioned your former colleagues. We'll go to one of those next. Cynthia Dietl is Director and Associate General Counsel of Civil Rights at Facebook. Cynthia, hello, how are you?
Good, Hassan. Thanks for your wonderful introduction. I think you were spot on with the statistics that you shared with our audience and with the rest of the panels. Like Greg and like Jay, I've worked with Noble in my prior life with the FBI. I spent 22 years in the FBI exclusively within the civil rights program. I've investigated hate crime, supervised hate crime investigations, and I've been involved in this work for quite a long time. And I have to appreciate, Hassan, that you first spoke about lynchings. And I think we all have to accept our history before we can really move forward with this discussion. And as we know from what history tells us, that law enforcement officers and agencies in large measure in the South have to accept their responsibility in the lynchings of African Americans. And it's hard to bridge those gaps between law enforcement and community without really accepting that history. We have, very sadly, a very long history in this country of genocide and of cultural genocide, of trying to erase and eliminate cultures of people from this country, and not just our Black friends and family, but also Mexicans and the indigenous populations, Chinese Americans. The list goes on, which is just horrifying. But I think we need to kind of accept where we are as a country, looking backwards first, before we can move forward and figure out how we're going to address hate speech and hate crime. I think two of the challenges that we face is there's 48 different laws in this country, with 48 different states that have hate crime statutes. 2 do not, Wyoming and South Carolina. I hope that changes soon. And then we have the federal statutes. It's a mixed bag of what conduct is criminalized based on where you are and what you did. So I think that's something that we have to navigate for those of us that live and work in the space of hate. And the other thing is, what can we do with NGOs and law enforcement and advocacy organizations to increase hate crime training for law enforcement prosecutors. With the Matthew Shepard Foundation, we trained almost 1,000 officers and prosecutors in almost 400 agencies in the past 4 years. And I would love to keep that going with our existing partnerships and stakeholders. And also we have to improve hate crime reporting. And I think we'll probably talk a little bit about that as we go on, but it can no longer be something that's optional. Hate crime reporting has to be mandatory, and all of the law enforcement organizations have to commit to doing better with documenting and reporting hate as they see it. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. I hope that your audience is very ambitious with their comments and with the chat function. I'd love to hear what people are thinking. That's how I learn and get better, but looking forward to the conversation. So thanks, Hassan.
Thank you, Cynthia. Next, we have Jay Greenberg. Jay is Deputy Assistant Director with the FBI's Criminal Investigative Division. How are you doing, Jay?
Hi, Hassan. Good afternoon here on the East Coast. And like everybody else, thank you very much for having me. The FBI is the first, last, and only stop for investigations into federal hate crimes. You mentioned a little bit earlier some of the disparities in numbers of prosecutions of different kinds of crimes. Obviously, we work hand in glove with our partners over at Department of Justice to move from investigation into prosecution for each one of the cases where we're involved. And I'd like to just thank you as well on behalf of Director Wray. Recently, Director Wray said of civil rights that civil rights are at the heart of what we do as an organization, because they're at the heart of who we are as a nation. And that is never more true today than today, in spite of the rising hate incidents and hate crimes that we've seen nationwide, and regrettably so, with sort of the polarized rhetoric that we're dealing with here in the nation. So again, it is an honor to be here today. The FBI has recently changed our priority. We are increasing the priority that we place on civil rights crimes investigations nationwide. All 56 of our field offices, led by our efforts here at headquarters, are in the process of adding additional resources to investigations, data collection, and community outreach nationwide. We plan to do that everywhere, but with specific emphasis on areas that we've seen in the past lack hate crime reporting or simply don't have reporting that we believe in line with what we expect to be happening there. So I know we'll talk about this at length, but I think the primary mandate that we'll be focusing on today is that our first mandate in the civil rights fight is to reconnect with communities at risk for hate crimes and to really forge trust-based relationships with them so that they feel comfortable coming forward reporting and that we capture that data correctly so we have a better idea of the scope of the problem we're dealing with. So thank you again for having us today.
Thank you, Jeff. And finally, we have John Cohen, Assistant Secretary of Counterterrorism at the Department of Homeland Security. Hi, John. Oh, I might have made an error here. John might not be on the call yet. If he does join, we'll patch him in, and he can jump right in and pick up wherever we are in the talk. So we'll jump right in. I mean, you guys all highlighted certain issues, new issues that I didn't mention in my intro, and related issues as well. And we'll talk about the underreporting for sure. But first, I wanted to start it off with you, Jay, and just start off with the question of, I think it's fair to say, based on the statistics I just gave and many others that you guys are no doubt familiar with, that there seems to be a reluctance, if you will, on the part of law enforcement, both local agencies and on the federal level, to label and or prosecute certain offenses as hate crimes, right? We saw this play out in the Atlanta spa shootings very recently, right? Where you had members of Congress openly referring to this as a hate crime. And obviously there are some concerns there about how it affects the prosecution if a crime is talked about too much or described in certain terms. But Jay, and anyone else who wants to jump in after Jay, why do you think there has been this historical reluctance to label and prosecute certain offenses that appear to be hate crimes, at least to the general public?
Okay, great question, Hassan. So a couple of things. First of all, I can't comment specifically on any ongoing cases that we're dealing with as an agency or that are out there in the public sphere right now, such as the Atlanta spa shootings. What I can say is that there are concurrent jurisdictions for violent crimes, which would also be characterized potentially in the federal system, depending on the specific facts and evidence, as hate crimes on the federal level. So, you're asking what is sort of the basis of reluctance in law enforcement in prosecuting or labeling attacks as hate crimes. I will tell you, I have not encountered a reluctance in law enforcement to label hate crimes attacks as hate crimes. What I have seen, though, is that frequently a hate crime is also an aggravated assault on the local level, or it's also a homicide on a local level. So where we may have a hate crime, or we may have hate speech that then grows to a threat that would also be in, say, a threat that goes across state lines, which would give us federal nexus to investigate an interstate threat. It's less so a reluctance to label something a hate crime and more that same crime fits multiple different laws where it could be prosecuted. As a prior investigator who investigated civil rights crimes to include abuse of force from officers, as well as hate crimes, which targeted various populations who were at risk. Frequently, we would have conversations with my partners from the local level, with local prosecutors, with federal prosecutors, and with Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. When it came time to charge a crime, we would look across the pantheon of available statutes, and we would identify the statute that was going to derive the most penalty for the person who committed the crime, and where we had the greatest evidence to underpin the elements of those laws or those specific laws which had been violated. And that's what we charged, because we felt it was more important to have a successful prosecution of somebody who committed one of these horrendous acts than it was to sort of gamble maybe on, can we get a hate crime prosecution here? I don't know, but can we get an aggravated assault with a deadly weapon that in this state would lead to X number of years imprisonment? And we felt comfortable with that, so we would pivot and move to that. But one thing that's changing this year, we are changing the system that we use to capture and collect the data. Our Criminal Justice Information Services, or CJIS division, has previously used one system to generate the Uniform Crime Report that collects and then publishes all this data annually. They're changing to a different system. And so we're moving to the National Incident-Based Reporting System. One of the key benefits of that system is that now local agencies can go back and amend prior filings, and they can also expand what they're reporting on in their data. Previously, the way that crime reporting worked for us in the Uniform Crime Report that you would look at every year, the most serious crime is what got marked in the report. So if there was a homicide and it was also tagged as a potential hate crime, homicide is how that one attack got reported. We've now expanded the way the algorithm works so that that crime could be reported as a hate crime as well as a homicide in the system. And so that will give us much more granularity, and hopefully we'll have the ability to have some better data because of that.
Thank you, Jay. And I know I said I'll leave it open for folks to jump in, but I'll go ahead and direct. I wish we could, and certainly when John gets on, we'll hear from our other government representative, his own perspective on this issue. But why don't we pass that on to Greg next? Greg, what are your thoughts on, is it fair to say there's a reluctance here? Why or why not? Anything you have to say in response to what Jay had to say?
I absolutely agree with Jay from sitting in his seat. That I don't think it's a reluctance. I think that's the wrong terminology. There's certainly some difficulties that come with it. There's also, as many of the listeners and folks who are on here who are in law enforcement have been to, there is always in the heat of the crime, in the aftermath, an immediacy from the community to call it something, to be that terrorism, be that a hate crime, and the FBI in particular, but all law enforcement. It's difficult sometimes. You can't rush. You have to actually see it through and go where the evidence takes you before you label it that. Now that's, I'll put a slight pause there. That is, and I've given this speech before, as have many of my colleagues, it will be investigated fully and thoroughly and methodically, regardless of what we call it. Yeah, and then we'll get to a prosecution phase. It brings to mind, and I almost laughed, Jay, I'm allowed to comment now on ongoing things. But I won't go into some of the federal issues. But if you look at the shooting that recently happened in Indianapolis, where the gentleman went into the FedEx facility, there was a massive rush. Again, is this terrorism? Is it domestic terrorism? Is it international terrorism? Is it a hate crime? And we're seeing, at least now it's coming out, that it was not motivated apparently by a racial bias or an ethnic bias. However, I always put out to people, when anybody, especially these mass shootings, that's always extremism. That's always hate. What we develop it down to is how can we prosecute it? What's the statute that it fits? So, and I definitely want to hear from Jerica and Cynthia on this. But I will say sometimes it's let's get to where the evidence takes us, and we know that as law enforcement professionals. And let's see, as my colleague said, hey, the most bang for the buck. What can we prosecute if that individual is still with us? What can we prosecute? What level can we? Is it local, state, or federal, where this person will receive the harshest penalty as he or she should for taking a life or committing an atrocity? And then we can work with the community to heal and talk about why we're calling it this or that.
Great. And yeah, well, we'll go ahead and follow your order there. Why don't we jump to Jerica and hear your thoughts next, and then Cynthia.
Sure, and thank you for the question. I don't think it's a reluctance. As someone who, covered a lot of these cases as a journalist and then worked as a spokeswoman for the Justice Department, I think there is a desire to make sure we get it right and that we don't put misinformation out there. And so there is, I think, a deliberateness to make sure that we're not rushing to judgment and that we actually have all the evidence involved. And as I think Jay pointed out earlier, that there is, even in marshaling all of this evidence, you also want to get to the point where you have the conviction. And it's sometimes very difficult from a prosecutorial standpoint to be able to speak to what's happening and what someone is thinking at the time. So I definitely think it's a reluctance piece, but just representing where I sit and understanding, I think the community and the fact that there oftentimes we are seeing these things happen, and the underlying factors make those that are observing all this recognize that there is something more amiss here. It's sometimes unsatisfying to not be able to call a thing and name it. And so I think that is why I think we all really need to work together on the data piece of this, because we recognize that the problem is large, but I think we struggle to sometimes be able to talk about the actual scope of it because of the difficulty in prosecuting these cases. So I think there's more that needs to be done. And I think there is a need to strike the balance and being able to label these activities as such, but also making sure that we have the sufficient evidence to do so.
Great, thank you, Jericho. Why don't we hear from Cynthia next?
So I'll throw the monkey wrench in here. I politely disagree with my colleagues. I think there is a very real documented reluctance to call a bias motivated crime a hate crime. I've seen this time and time again in the hate crime trainings that we have carried out across the country. When you really get down into the weeds and you ask detectives, hey, I read this in the news, clearly a hate crime, you didn't report it as such, tell me why. There's a whole lot of reasons and a lot of very strong evidence of the reluctance, whether it's the chief doesn't want to hear about something being labeled a hate crime because then he's going to hear it from the community, or the officer doesn't know how to label a hate crime or why, doesn't understand the meaning of a swastika on a synagogue, so it's not labeled as a hate crime, or does understand, doesn't want to label his city and his community full of haters. I think that's a very real reluctance to almost of self-preservation from law enforcement and in the community, is not to admit what they think they're seeing and not to admit that they have white supremacists or they have people motivated to do very bad things for bias motivated reasons. Nobody wants to admit that those people live next door. And I think how that ripples across communities is what happens if you are a large city that profits off tourism and you have a very high profile hate crime that occurred. You're not going to say it's a hate crime because will you lose tourism money? Will you lose economic opportunity? Will people stop buying houses in your community if you think it's full of haters because your hate crime numbers went up? So I think there's a very real reluctance and very real opposition to documenting and reporting hate crimes as such across way too many communities. And I would echo that. I think the other missing piece, and I think Jericho did mention this, was the victim's perspective. So if you tell a victim of a hate crime that what happened to her or him was not motivated by hate, and is not going to be investigated or prosecuted as such, believe me, they're going to know and they're going to remember and they're going to blame law enforcement for that. And they don't want to hear about jurisdiction and conflicting laws and proving the bias motivation is hard. They don't want to hear anything about that. All they heard from you was what happened to them was not what they know to be true. So it's, I think the reluctance piece is absolutely there and needs to be addressed.
Thank you, Cynthia. And I mean, you know, sort of to your point here about victims and the community, I think part of what I think we have data supporting both that, not only that law enforcement agencies underreport crime, but that victims, right? That the people who these things happen to don't always report it as a crime, and more particularly as a hate crime, right? So sort of with that in mind, I want to ask you guys a second question here. You know, what are sort of the biggest challenges that law enforcement faces in dealing with this problem? And I want to keep in mind what to me seems like a big problem in this area, which is trust with the community, right? Having the trust between the community members and their local law enforcement and the federal law enforcement agencies, so that they feel when something happens to them that I can go to the police, it will be understood the way, not necessarily, if accurate, at least, it will be understood the way I understood it and prosecuted it and dealt with that way. So what are the two biggest challenges facing law enforcement in this problem, and what is there to be said about trust with the community? And we can, why don't we start with Greg on this one?
I think it's a very real thing, and we're seeing at least some efforts. I mentioned in kind of the opening statements, and I think Hassan, you did also, that we no longer can look at this as just a law enforcement problem or a government problem or a private. It's all of our problem. and that getting that community to report. There are, as you mentioned, and often these are communities at risk, be it the transgender community or communities of color, however that goes across, that are reluctant to say anything or to report or to go to law enforcement. We've seen this time and time again. The ability that some of the organizations like the ADL or the Urban League that can maybe work with the law enforcement communities to bridge this gap, to say that, hey, the community, you can come forward in safety, whether it just be to talk and explain it to them, which sometimes helps, or go deeper and then work with our law enforcement partners to say, we're going to have to find a unique solution to this, because the victim isn't going to come to you, but the victim will come to this trusted party and we can work something out. It's unique, it's not perfect, but the more we can get people to actually report and we can diagnose as a country or a community where the problem is, the better law enforcement is going to be able to deal with these issues. It's a terrible analogy that we've used too often, but it resonates because of the time we're in. But if we had this pandemic or COVID, where we just weren't testing or knowing where the centers were, where are the hot spots, how do we treat that? And if it's just people are afraid to get tested or to report, it just doesn't work. We're not going to get better. As a matter of fact, we're going to get worse, which is an area where we're in right now. So that those efforts coming forward, I've seen, and it's the FBI made some very big efforts this year, uniquely to those of us who were associated with the organization, to reach out to those communities, to go and to do some advertising, actually, and put out signs and saying, hey, it can be helpful to report, and here's some different ways you can do it. It's a step, and I know at a local and state level, we're seeing a lot of agencies start this and reach out because they know there's a problem. So again, that community, that all of us collectively working together, I think gets that reporting out there, and trying to think about it in a new and updated, unique way will get us a little to a better place.
And Jay, what about you? What is there to be said on this end about the biggest challenges facing law enforcement, including that obvious challenge of trust with the community members and the victims that these crimes happen to and happen in?
I think that is, in fact, the largest challenge facing law enforcement today is rebuilding community trust. In the wake of what's happened with Breonna Taylor and George Floyd very publicly, I think that there is, that is, once again, we're hearkening back to Rodney King and then times before then. If you look at the amount of sort of destruction that we saw last summer, a lot of the numbers, the insurance estimates of damage done based on anger-fueled violence out in our communities is very, very similar to those two incidents, even though they were separated by almost 30 years. And that says that we haven't come as far forward as we need to in building law enforcement community relations. So to that end, this year we are doing a couple of things organizationally. The first is we are launching a national anti-hate campaign. And as Greg is referring to, that is going to be amplified in each of our field offices, and it's going to be tailored in each of our field offices. So in Albuquerque, the messaging that you might see might reach out to Navajo Nation community members, whereas in San Francisco and New York, where we have larger AAPI communities, we'll see emphasis put there. So recently in New York, there were some ads that went out basically saying hate crimes are not okay. You cannot be victimized because of where you're from or what language you speak or what you look like. That is not okay. And you should report that and get support from law enforcement if you believe that that's happening to you. That was translated into a number of different languages to reach the populations that are there in New York. In San Francisco, we used, again, different perspectives of people who look different because they come from different ethnic and religious and national backgrounds. And we wrapped the municipal buses and we ran ads for 60 days, basically saying, if this happens, or if you know of this happening in your community, bring it forward so that we can address it. So I think the first and primary barrier that we're trying to overcome at this point is really those communities who are at risk, knowing that if I'm here illegally and I report this crime, am I going to get arrested for being here illegally? And that's not the approach that we in the FBI or we in the federal government take. We have a victim-centered approach when it comes to investigating any kind of violent crime, whether it includes a hate bias or not, in concert with our local partners. So really getting the word out and rebuilding trust. I think, the other sort of element that we can't stress enough is that there are over 800,000 law enforcement officers nationwide. There are very, very few use of force incidents in the nation, and there are even fewer that rise to the level that the use of force was inappropriate. But I don't believe that that is the view of law enforcement in many of our communities today. And I'm not saying that the view is wrong, right? We have a long way to go to rebuild trust. What I am saying, though, is that I think that there is sort of a belief right now in communities that they can't trust law enforcement, or they're scared of law enforcement, or they're scared of reporting something to law enforcement and becoming the focus of law enforcement. And so really, engaging with communities and sort of extending olive branches over and over and over. We were just meeting with a number of historically Black college and university staffs, talking about how we need to increase our outreach, which will also help with diversity recruiting that we're currently engaged in. And one of the comments from the crowd as we were meeting with dozens of the HBCUs in the crowd was, hey, you might need to extend the olive branch and then hold it there for a minute. Don't extend it and pull it back, but extend it and hold it there a minute and give us time to get used to the idea that you're really asking for input here, and let us float something, and we want to see what kind of response you're going to get. So I really do think the primary barrier for us is going to be, solidifying that community trust in the law enforcement that is here to serve, and the recognition by the community as well over time, if they are getting different service, that they're aware that they're getting different service, and that sort of starts to change the perception as well.
And Cynthia, I want to kick it to you. Obviously, Facebook's sort of the way Facebook is situated in relation to this problem is unique among the panelists in a sense. But Facebook is one of the largest sources of information in the country, right? It's almost like cable television at this point, right? And it's one of the main sources of information for many people. We've heard a bit about the role organizations like the ADL and other advocacy groups can play in supporting law enforcement. But what are your thoughts on this end and in your role about the biggest challenges facing law enforcement and that challenge of community trust? Is there something that Facebook could do as a media source in the United States? Any other thoughts?
I think very broadly, I think one of the things that Facebook does and can always do, even on a broader scale, is bring people together. And it's the same thing that Greg and Jay were talking about. How do you bring people together? How do you extend that olive branch? Who's the right messenger to extend the olive branch? Who are you extending it to? What are your motivations? What's your end goal? There's so much that goes into trying to bridge those gaps. But I do want to just flag one thing I brought up earlier, and I want to say it again because I'm learning more about this, and it's something that I knew as an agent, but I'm really seeing it more on the ground now, is this generational trauma. One of the things that we saw this past June, which is Pride Month, is that a lot of pride parades around the country were having difficulty with inviting law enforcement to march in the pride parade in uniform. And these were officers that identify as part of the LGBTQ community, but they were prohibited from marching with their community because they were police officers. The reason they weren't welcomed in is because of the uniform and because of the job that they do. So we even see that there's these splits even among a certain community, splitting amongst itself with trying to keep certain people who identify the same way separate and apart. So I really believe that before olive branches can be extended, I really think that police chiefs and the FBI specifically need to do a much better job of publicly acknowledging their role in the past of keeping certain cultures and races and ethnicities down and their involvement in oppressing certain people. I think that has to be acknowledged. And I've seen many police chiefs do just that across the country and really talk about their agency's history with lynching and their agency's accountability and responsibility for what they did decades ago. So I really hope that that's something that kind of reckoning with our history is something that we do as current and former law enforcement to really understand what we did badly and acknowledging and apologizing for that before we can move forward. I think that has to happen.
And Jerica, you know, we've mentioned, or the other panelists have brought up sort of outreach to HBCUs. They've brought up the role that organizations like ADL and you guys at National Urban League can serve sort of as a trusted community partner, if you will, but in between, as a liaison between the community and the police. What are your thoughts on this issue of trust being one of the biggest challenges here?
Well, I will say I am a proud graduate of Spelman College, a historically Black college in Atlanta, Georgia. So I definitely think it is really important when we are talking about law enforcement and there being trust, is there need to be a diversity in law enforcement, a diversity of experiences. And so that I think is one way to increase trust within the community. But I think it speaks to the point that Cynthia lifted up earlier. We have to really go through a period of truth and reconciliation in this country. When we are talking about law enforcement, many folks immediately think policing. And if we really trace the roots of that back, we do go to slavery and slave patrols. And so that experience and that passed down information and trauma that different communities in this country, particularly communities of color and other marginalized groups have experienced over the years, does not go away. And I think oftentimes what exacerbates the problem is when we have a lack of ability from law enforcement or desire to sometimes police itself. So when we do see some of these tragedies come to the forefront, and they are actually tied to members of law enforcement. If we just looked at the events of January at the top of the year, we saw, members of law enforcement actually being harmed and trying to protect the Capitol by other members or former members of law enforcement. So like any industry that we're talking about, there are going to be people that have the spirit of hate, the spirit of extremism, and they permeate every facet of our society. But if we want really to have a community that feels that it can trust law enforcement, there needs to be consequences and repercussions and accountability when we see members of law enforcement engaging in activity that so many of us seem to see as extremism, hate, and violence itself. So I think it's critical, the truth and reconciliation piece, the diversity piece, but also the accountability piece. And if we don't see accountability, I don't think we're ever going to be able to move forward and have the type of trust from the community around these issues that we desire.
All right, great. And we're actually, I see there's a lot of folks, this isn't one of the audience questions that's been slated to be asked later just yet, but I see a lot of folks commenting in the chat in response to your statements, Jerica, and to what Cynthia was saying. So I'll stick on this end a little bit and just toss it over to Jay. So Jay, Jerica just mentioned the prevalence of former law enforcement and a couple current law enforcement officers at the January 6th attack. Certainly, the federal government has been aware for a very long time right now of how prevalent and common it is for especially former military and former law enforcement officers and so forth to be members of extremist groups or be participants in extremist attacks and hate crimes. What is there to be said, Jay, on this end in terms of law enforcement accountability and a public acknowledgement, as Cynthia said, of the historical and ongoing role that sometimes law enforcement officers, in particular, compared to sort of however else you want to split up the population, has in these events, Jay?
Okay, so again, a couple of items to highlight here. So I have to be very careful about talking about any ongoing cases. Obviously, all the investigations into what happened January 6th and the Capitol riots, those are ongoing investigations. So I won't be able to specifically comment on those, but let me comment sort of on the structure of what you introduced, which is a couple of things. And the first is, the way I see it, what is sort of law enforcement's desire to police itself, or willingness or reluctance, either way, to police itself, number one, and number two, what's sort of driving the extremism that we continue to see in society. So first, let me just back up and acknowledge what Cynthia and Jerica have talked about. We don't normally find success in sort of making an empathic connection with huge groups, even something like this where we're online, and apologizing for things that happened in the past. That requires a sincere exchange. So I can tell you that what we do expect to be happening at each one of our field offices is that the leaders of those field offices, the executive managers, the special agents in charge, and their deputies, the assistant special agents in charge, are meeting with community leaders and with law enforcement leaders together as a group. And we have to act globally, but we have to connect locally to do that. So that what happened in Selma, or that what happened with Dr. King, those are very real historical facts everywhere that we have to address, but there are also specific local incidents that have been passed down in community culture and community lore that those wounds have to be healed, right? First, we have to deal with the scar tissue before the organism can heal all the way. And that has to happen locally. I could sit here today and say, here's what the FBI has done wrong in the past, and here's what we need to do to right it in the future. But it's going to be much more powerful if our local leaders are sitting with law enforcement there and community organizations and community members in the room and having an open back and forth dialogue. And so we expect that to be happening everywhere. I will tell you, as an agent who worked hate crimes and color of law investigations, which are our two primary subprograms within our civil rights program, previously, the most successful sort of avenue I used to go down to get prosecutions, to get to chargeable violations of the crimes involving use of force by other police officers, is when I would talk with an officer who had been at a scene where another officer had inappropriately used force or had used excessive force. And I would talk with that officer and say, hey, we're not here conducting a witch hunt. We're here talking about what happened right here in front of you. And you can be part of the solution, who's going to tell the truth about what you saw, or you can hide what you saw. And if you hide that, when I get a good warrant to go through a door on a legitimate case, and you're right there next to me going through that door, it's more dangerous for you and me, because we will have wronged somebody as a law enforcement agency or as a law enforcement community right here. And if we don't police ourselves and we don't make sure that our badges stay polished up and free from shame, then when we go through a door, the person on that receiving end, they may respond to us with pent-up rage of not having good, adequate law enforcement that is impartial as a representative when we go through the door. We might be there, we might be righteous in our mission that day. But if we have harmed that community because of our inability to police ourselves and even call other officers out when we see them do something wrong, then we're putting ourselves at a disadvantage when we go through a door. So let me just start there, sort of on part one, which is that we do have to police ourselves. I will tell you that in my different cases, every single time I won at trial, and I did not win every single time at trial, and I did not, every case where I believe that we should have gotten to a prosecutable crime, we couldn't get to, because facts are hard to deliver, right? The evidence that comes out in front of a jury, or the evidence you can put in front of a grand jury, doesn't always get you where I believe I know I was, but knowing is not probable cause to charge or to get a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. So that's sort of part one. And then part two, in terms of extremism, law enforcement or military involvement, what we're seeing is a deepening of the drivers of extremism right now. And so those drivers do include perceptions of government overreach or law enforcement overreach, but they also include racial tensions and socio-political conditions, disenfranchisement within society. And then because of the amount of hate that is available that people can download and stream into their homes, we're seeing a great deal of what we call self-radicalization at home, just like we did with ISIS. I didn't have to go to the Middle East to get ISIS's message and bring it into my home and listen to that hate drip into my soul and then encourage me to go out and do some horrific act. That's available all online right now. And we are seeing that continue to propagate where people can bring that into their homes. So really what we've seen is just a ongoing divisiveness in the way that we publicly talk about all these things is in fact driving people in the extremes to horrific actions. And really we want to get in front of that and help reconnect with communities so that they can highlight, this person is a risk to my community. Can you, law enforcement, come in? I trust you. Help me identify this person. Help me take this person out so that they don't harm my community.
Great. And, Cynthia, I want to kick it to you, since Jay mentioned the role of social media often plays in radicalizing folks. What is there to be said? Obviously, Facebook is not a public utility, but it almost virtually is, right? The reach it has is similar to a public utility, right? What is there to be said about whether or not Facebook has been a good steward of all that reach and power that it has to shape thought in America? Is there more that Facebook could be doing specifically on that end? Because we kind of have a model of how these things happen very often, right? And it's not a complicated, super complex process, right? It's someone watching videos, being exposed to certain hateful information, kind of following the algorithms and going down a rabbit hole and watching other videos, gathering more information, connecting with networks of other people who think similarly, and so forth and so on. And we've seen this happen repeatedly in the investigative histories, as far as we know, of various crimes around the country. So is Facebook doing all it can? Is there more that Facebook and other social media companies could be doing to sort of help in this area to prevent hateful messages from being spread, given the state of things are so risky and precarious at the moment in the country?
So I think one of the things that Facebook does well is, and you can read about the statistics and our community standards online. You can, do your own independent research, which I always encourage people to do. But you can see that Facebook removes 97% of hate speech before it's ever reported to Facebook. So we find it and we take it down. It's not tolerated on the platform. Many Facebook spokespeople have said repeatedly that, we're doing much better than we were doing in the past. We can always do even better and make that statistic 100% of the content comes down before it's reported to us if it violates our community standards. So, getting to 100 from 97, I hope that's something that we can do. But I think the other thing to keep in mind is that, and this is something, again, I learned as a very baby young FBI agent, is that hate is taught. You don't start off life hating somebody, you don't, because of their ethnic background or their race. It's something that you're taught. And usually that's by your parents, it's by your familial structure, it's by your neighborhood, your school. It's something that you learn and you adopt when you're very, very young over time. And yes, of course, you're going to want to find people that think the way you do and want to do what you want to do in life. And so you seek out people who maybe have the same ideology that you do. And, that's something that I've always hoped that could be addressed before anybody ever knows what social media is. I hope that's something that can be addressed at home and in the schools and in communities to really figure out how to stop that hate from blossoming and becoming a real threat to the FBI as the person gets older. I'm going to shut up because I could talk about this all day long, and I'd rather hear from one of the other panelists.
No, that's fair enough. Did anyone want to jump in on the question about social media?
I will.
Look at
I will
that,
only
you
add that
stymie.
Cynthia,
Oh, there we go.
No, I was going to get Cynthia off the hook, but I think the audience is seeing what a lot of us, especially Jay and I, know, that Cynthia taught us, most of us, about hate crimes when she was in the Bureau, and is still teaching me to this day. But I think we have to recognize, and I agree, it's easy to demonize either social media or a platform, or say this is an extremist platform. Remember, the platform's just software. It's the people who are on it that are putting things on there. And I have seen, and I'll name Facebook and a lot of the other, not all of them, the social media platforms do make an honest effort, and they try to moderate. And it's almost like policing the internet. the bigger the platform, the harder it is. But they do make those efforts, and they are very responsive when it's pointed out that this is wrong and that comes off. Again, not universally, but I think we really do need to recognize that it is the new influencer. And I hate to even say new because it's been with us a while. This is where people are going to form their thoughts. As Cynthia pointed out, you're not born with these hateful thoughts, but where are they coming from? And more, this is how sometimes exclusively people do communicate, or where they're getting their quote education from. Specific or particularly right now during this national crisis, where a lot of people are at home or can't go out, can't socialize, so it's all online now. So it's something we need to work with, something we need to moderate. I am not for taking away from the First Amendment rights that we all have in our country, but we're also, nobody has a right to encourage violence, to encourage hate, or to educate people in these different ideologies that are hate-filled. But there's a fine line. I will point out that ADL has been working with Facebook a lot and with some of the other providers, and we are trying to get along with the Urban League and our government partners to find that happy medium where we can moderate this, we can provide a safe space for people, but also give you your right to express yourself in whatever way you want to be.
Great. And
please,
please,
I was going to say, I'd like to jump in really quickly. I definitely think the rise of social media has helped the spread of this. And as Cynthia pointed out, it clearly exists before you even get online. But I think the medium has transferred, right? Instead of hoods or masks or, people can hide behind a computer screen. And I think they have the ability to touch a larger group of people than they would have before. I mean, that speaks to Jay's point about self-radicalization. It's happening. I think in addition to social media, though, we also need to look at traditional media outlets as well. I think sometimes what ends up happening is we have these tragedies across the country and we spend less time humanizing the victim and talking about their lives, and we spend more time focused on the person who committed the crime. We lift their name up over and over and over again, and it emboldens people. So for those who are interested in not only spewing their hate and acting upon it, but becoming a martyr in the eyes of other folks that believe as they do, instead of, I think, highlighting the accountability piece and highlighting the victims, we put too much attention on those that are actually the arbiters of this type of violence. And I think we need to be thoughtful from a traditional media standpoint about how we approach these things, in addition to kind of monitoring this and being more proactive on social media. I think all forms of media have played a role in this across our country.
It'd be great to hear you guys' thoughts. This one, I will say it and actually mean it this time. It will actually be open to to the whole panel, whoever wants to jump in first. But along the same lines that we're talking now, we're talking about solutions that go, outside the purview really of almost any of the stakeholders, right? We're talking about traditional media. That's not any of you guys' job, but along those same lines, right? In terms of innovative solutions, new avenues to address these problems. There are a lot of advocates nowadays. I've spoken with a few grassroots advocates recently who essentially mentioned that, the traditional solution that most of the members of this panel work on and have in mind, given we're here at Noble, arrest a guy, hopefully label it what it is if it appears to be that way to the public and is supported by the evidence, charge him with the tag him with the highest, most serious offense and give him the largest number of years you can. I spoke with some advocates recently who sort of were deflecting away from that sort of approach, right? That, the punitive aspect of how we deal with these things isn't so important because we can get one guy off the street for having done something terrible. But like we're talking about, the ideas are still out there, right? The underlying problem of racism or sexism or transphobia still exists, and that things need to be done on that level to address those issues. So again, I'll open this out up to the panel in terms of talking about policy solutions for lawmakers and just sort of innovative approaches to dealing with the rise in extremism. What are you guys' thoughts on that end? I see Cynthia is unmuted. I don't know if that's a mistake, but you can feel free to go first, Cynthia.
Well, thank you. That was not a mistake. I was going to make one quick point, and then I'll let my colleagues jump in. So I'm really glad you brought that up. There is a real groundswell in the country to figure out a different way forward than just incarceration or paying a fine if you're convicted of committing a hate crime, because what happens at the end? So the fine is paid, the person is released from prison. Maybe there's some supervised release at the end, but then what? Chances are that hate is still very well and alive and living in that person. And what is she going to do after they're released? So I love exploring more research in this area and really figuring out what is the true way forward. And it's, again, one of the things that I learned a long time ago is when you have a crime that's committed, you're not just, as law enforcement, I think we're not just helping the victim who desperately needs our help, but we also have to look to the perpetrator and to his family and say, okay, what can we do for you? Because is there a chance that you will commit a crime again? Is there a chance that there's a danger to society once you're released from incarceration? You know, what are we trying to do here? I mean, what is really our goal? And if our goal is to address the hate that is alive and brewing in the perpetrator, how do we do that? And who do we align with? And who do we talk to? And who can we collaborate with to address that and to figure out where that person's place is in or outside of our society? So I'm glad that's part of the criminal justice reform discussion and conversations, because I think we need to devote a lot more time to it.
I don't want to cut off my colleagues, but I'll double tap on what Cynthia just said. I think when you're looking at us as talking to this audience as law enforcement, we're at the end of the solution. It's somebody's committing a crime, somebody's doing something, and we have only certain abilities. You're going to have to arrest somebody. You can intervene a little bit, but when it gets to this point, as we've all talked about, this journey into hate that kind of coalesces into a crime, that's a journey that started somewhere, that continued. Somebody self-radicalized or was with a group or was listening to other people. And we need to recognize, as a former law enforcement officer, and I think I can speak for all of us, we don't need any more criminals. We would love to spend some time, effort, and capital and work with others to turn people away, to off-road them, the prevention piece. It's not the only solution, but there is no argument. We cannot arrest our way out of this problem. It's just causing the problem to exponentially expand. So I think the effort that we need to put into, and I've been tracking along in the chat, what folks have been talking about along with education internally with law enforcement is the same thing. That's a great step. We need to be doing that externally, that education piece. Where does this hate come from? Talking to people, exposing some of these ideologies or this hate-filled speech for what it is, identifying and turning a spotlight on it, and not just putting it away, because we talked about deplatforming or moving people off, but really exposing it. Because deplatforming just means somebody goes somewhere else and spreads their message. We really need to start educating people where this hate comes from. And that part of that comes with providing people some kind of services, be they mental health services, be they some kind of counseling that they can go to. And it's not, something that is in my wheelhouse, but I recognize the ability, as you can see, to turn people away from something, or to at least educate them to why this is bad, why this path is wrong. And then they can make some more decisions. But we can always show them as law enforcement, this is the end of the journey. If you keep down this path, somebody's getting hurt, victims are going to come out of it, and something terrible is going to happen. Why would you continue down this way? And we've worked with this I know in the Bureau with the Countering Violent Extremism and some of the other precursors to this that we've all looked at. That's what we're all talking about. What are the services that are out there? And there's not too many. There are some institutes that Jerica and I have worked with, like McCain and other groups that try this prevention piece. That's a part of the puzzle that's got to be in there, that we need to work together with our communities, with law enforcement, with the private sector to offer some of these off-roads.
Hey, Hassan, this is Jay. I'd like to maybe just raise a couple of things that we should be looking at. So I got to be a little bit careful with policy. Obviously, I don't want to say what kind of legislation we need or what kind of policy we need out there. But I do think that we as a country need to start continue our journey looking into sort of the confluence of mental health and those that struggle with mental health, and then the prevalence of sort of this hate-filled speech that they can bring into their homes, and the ease with which they can also go get the weapons that they need to do mass acts of violence. So, I don't know the exact right answer there. There are loads of constitutional protections around all of that. But I think the first step is that we as a country need to say, this can't happen anymore. These mass acts of violence can't happen anymore. And that may be a hard message. If I, as a father, think that my son might pose a danger to the community, then I have to start, that's a very complicated situation for me to step into and feel like I know the right path out of that. So I think that that's one area we can focus. I've mentioned a lot on community outreach and on bridging the gap between law enforcement and community. That's an area that we need to continue to focus. We need to continue to fund those efforts. We need to be putting positive messages out in media that can reach people across a variety of communities. And then, what I'd really like to see sort of coming back as a third leg of that stool would be those communities we're talking about that are at-risk communities. I would love to see members of those communities join me in the ranks of law enforcement, because I can sit here and tell you all day long that I'm here to bring you equal protection under the law. And I do not see people differently, regardless how they look or regardless whether they believe what I believe or not. But that's not nearly as powerful as having diverse ranks within law enforcement. And we have continued to focus on that as an organization. I know nationwide applications are down to police organizations nationwide. It is a situation where we're just not seeing the same number of applications to join law enforcement. And I would love to see those numbers come back up from people from different communities who are saying, I want to be the change that I want to see. And I'm willing to vote with my feet and vote with my time and my passion and my opportunity.
Great, and we are nearing the end here. And please get those for the attendees. Please get any questions you want into the chat. We'll take a few minutes and answer those towards the end. We have a few minutes remaining for our formal talk, so I'll just kick it to each of the panelists to give a closing remark or any thoughts on sort of what to expect in the future. I won't define future very, very much, but what do you guys see when you look out on the landscape in this area? What do we see coming down the line? It seems like the country's at a pretty dangerous point. I'll just leave it at that. But any closing remarks, any thoughts on the future of this issue of the rise in extremism around the country? We can start off with Greg.
I was a little quicker than Cynthia on the button on that one.
Yes, you were quick on the draw that time.
And now I'm going to regret that. But I think, to echo what the opening comments kind of started with it, and when we thought about it, the last couple of years, we have seen this rise. My, bureau time was spent mostly on domestic extremism and terrorism, co-joined with hate crimes and working with my colleagues. I have never seen the rise this quickly, this fast. And what we've looked at it very closely here at ADL, and again, with a lot of our colleagues, it is not, I'm not here to politicize anything. It is that there seemed to be at least a perception and an openness that these ideologies would be accepted, that white supremacy, that, left wing, all the different extremisms, put the label in front of it you want, are accepted. And in a certain way, when we look at it, it was over the last couple of years that society said, okay, and it allowed this to grow. I am still concerned with, and the Bureau and Jay's capable hands and others, is, are we seeing more people? You're obviously January 6th being not the end of anything, but the beginning. Are we seeing this monster for the first time in its entirety, or are it still getting more adherents coming towards these different ideologies? We don't know, and there's investigations and ongoing analysis of that. But what it's safe to say is that we have recognized that it's here. It's not going to go away. It may go dormant, it may go quiet, it may go underground, but it's still there and we've seen it. And if we ignore it or continue to ignore it, it's going to grow. And we're going to see events like January 6th with extremists, or this rise in hate crime unprecedented, going up, as we mentioned, 100% increase in murders. We need to do groups like this where we talk about it, recognize it's there, educate ourselves and our society, and make sure that we have that appropriate policing and that appropriate investigative tools to look into that and safeguard those civil rights that we want to maintain so we can continue to go on as a nation. But I'll leave that with, I didn't want to take anybody else's time, and I know we have some questions.
That's fine. Much appreciated, Greg. Jerica, how about you? Any closing thoughts?
Just one short one. It really takes a coalition. It takes a collective effort. I mean, Greg pointed to a lot of the organizations that are doing this work, but it involves law enforcement. It involves the civil rights community and other justice-oriented groups. It involves the private sector. It involves our government. I mean, one of the things that are just really critical is that we have to look at the history of caste in this country. So we're having this conversation is about whether it's on the rise or if it's just becoming more apparent because of the rhetoric that's been out there in our country. I mean, it is part of the fabric. And the reason that we continue to see these things and we can continue to talk about them is because we have never reckoned with our past. And when we're talking about groups that are focused on hate, oftentimes if you pull back the veil, it leads to being in a space where they felt ignored, neglected, impoverished, and because of caste, they feel like there needs to be someone that's either the cause of their problems or in order to feel better about one's current situation, they need to feel empowered. And unfortunately, sometimes people resort to violence. And so that the separation of community, the separation and putting group against group has been part of the American story. And until we focus on that and acknowledge that and work together collectively to create a new American story that says this behavior is unacceptable and will not be allowed to continue to permeate our society and fester and go unchecked, then we're going to continue to be in this cycle. So although we've seen the rise, I am hopeful because of the conversations that I've had the opportunity to be a part of and the groups I've had the opportunity to work collectively with. In order to come forward with a meaningful solution, we have to identify the problem. We've done that. Now we need to focus on the step and the path forward.
Great. And I will hopefully get a chance to, we've got some really great audience questions trickling in now. Hopefully get a chance to give Jay and Cynthia a minute or two unstructured to say what you'd like. But I'll jump to some of the audience questions here since we're approaching 3 o'clock. So one question here is someone's pointing out the statistics we discussed at the outset of the conversation. And the question is essentially, why were 80-something% of the reported cases of hate crimes not prosecuted? The person's asking, is it that most of the cases were inappropriately charged as hate crimes, or is there some other reason for the non-prosecution? That one seems clearly directed at Jay.
Okay, Hassan, you got me now?
Yes.
Okay, very good. So I think you actually gave that statistic during the opening. I'm not sure exactly what statistic you're referring to, so I can't talk to any numbers that we didn't specifically pull or we're not citing from our crime report. What I can tell you from my experience is that not every single case that I have investigated, even where I knew something wrong had happened, resulted in a prosecution. So getting from an attack or something that occurred or a potential violation of a law all the way to an arrest, a charge via indictment, a jury trial or a plea and a conviction, it's an incredibly long and complicated process. So I can't speak to the numbers you gave at the beginning. What I can tell you is it's incredibly hard to go from investigating an allegation of a crime all the way to a successful prosecution. And so, different cases fall out at different stages. Again, not being familiar with the statistic that you're talking to specifically.
Right. And I'll just note I'll send out the reporting there. But that was actually it was a Bureau of Justice Statistics report.
I did. So Hassan, I did see that report that you mentioned, and I think and I'm glad that BJA does that research and that analysis. I think what I didn't see from that report, and it could be because I didn't read it as thoroughly as maybe somebody else, but I think, and Jay and Greg know this, I think for every hate crime investigation that's initiated, you may not know the truth as to why that case wasn't prosecuted as a hate crime. So it may be documented by the US Attorney's Office one way as to why it wasn't prosecuted, and the FBI may have put a more general designation as to why that case was closed. And so then that true reason didn't make its way to a BJA statistic. So I think there's a lot of inconsistency and lack of real clarity regarding the reasons for a case not to be prosecuted. So I would say that. And I think the other reason is just because maybe the FBI or a state agency didn't prosecute that crime as a hate crime, it could have been prosecuted somewhere else. There could have been a civil remedy. There could have been some racial and reconciliation method that was attached to that incident. So it's just that BJA report, it may not tell the whole story. So I think there's more to look at there.
Right, and another question we have here from the audience is about the FBI and bias and diversity training, cultural diversity training. What trainings does the FBI endorse or employ nationally? Does it provide any training nationally to all their agents? Is it mandatory?
Good question. We do have mandatory diversity training as part of being an onboard employee with the FBI, and we have built diversity into every hiring process that we have as well. So as we're promoting, today's investigators to tomorrow's leaders and then beyond, and grooming them for growth in the organization, we are constantly focusing on implicit bias and unknown bias that you may bring to a situation. And then as well, what have you done to promote diversity and inclusion where you sit today, and how could you use a broader pulpit to continue to do so?
I think one other question we have here, I think is a pretty difficult question, but I think also necessary and very interesting to talk about. Some folks are pointing out here, since we're a few of the panelists have mentioned education, right, and outreach to teach the community, because as Cynthia said, hate is often taught, and so some education and teaching is necessary to reverse those effects or counter them. And so some folks are asking, what is there to be said about the racial division in the country that sometimes complicates education, right? We have a national debate over critical race theory, right? That used to be just a thing that law students talked about, right? And that was it. And now it's a national debate from teaching history in middle school all the way up to college levels and graduate schools and so forth and so on. And so the question essentially is, how are we going to do this education if the country can't even agree over teaching the history of race in the country? And I'll add my own bit to that to sort of complicate it. Is it does seem to me that the bully pulpit that the president has and the White House and the administration has great effect here, right? Public sentiment and how people thought about Islamist and terrorism changed vastly when President George Bush started talking about it, right? And talking about it the way he did. So that question with the addendum, what is there to be said about racial division and how difficult that makes education in this country? And then also, does the White House, should the administration take on a more prominent role in making clear the message of the United States that that's not something that we tolerate in this country, that it doesn't represent our values? I'll start with Cynthia.
I was going to make you start with Jerica. My really quick answer, and I think Jerica, this is probably your sweet spot right here, but I think my quick answer is the power of the ballot box. So we know, just because we live in this country and we're probably all very politically active, that you make changes by who you vote for. And if you decide not to vote, that's your vote. So whether it's for your local school board or your local city council, these changes are going to be made at the grassroots level based on who you vote for. I think we need to start with that. And I think that's how you start to really drive that change.
Jerica, how about you?
Well, I think Cynthia made a great point. Civic engagement really needs to be part of the DNA of every person in this country. On the critical race theory, I had the opportunity to study that in law school. I think sometimes we can get caught up in terms and semantics and we lose people. But the simplest way to, I think, explain it is it's truth telling. I think unfortunately in this country, we've had different versions of the history that we felt comfortable with sharing, and we've never quite told the complete history. And that's really all it is. And so I think we have a diverse community, we have a diverse society, and all of the stories that are relevant, that tell the full history of the United States, from the indigenous community to all the other communities of color and marginalized communities, the LGBTQ plus community. We need to make sure everybody's story is told. And we're not able to move forward in a healthy and productive way by keeping that history under wraps and keeping it in the shadows. That ignorance is exactly what fuels what we're seeing as it relates to hate, because there's miseducation of our young people and there's miseducation of our adults up and down the line. And so to me, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that we're even on this call, having this conversation about hate. It's because we didn't do what we needed to do on day one, which is to tell the complete, unadulterated truth here in this country. And so I'm a proponent of supporting elected officials, people that are pursuing higher office, that are committed to truth telling and transparency, because I think without it, we're not going to be able to move forward.
And Greg, what are your thoughts on this end too? The sort of the complications of trying to educate folks about bias in general, not just race, but bias in general in this country.
I think, and my colleagues are hitting it right on the head. When we look at societies that are oppressed, that aren't getting factual, it's all because the history of what the education system is not teaching the truth. And when we look at our country, that's what we have to do. It's as simple as that. We need to teach the truth. And the truth is our history is rich and varied and represents everybody in every segment of our society. And to exclude people because we haven't done it before isn't good enough. So I know there's a controversy when we talk about it, but it's as simple as really, and it's a combination of what Jerica and Cynthia said. First, we need to educate the truth. We need to tell our youth, here's what happens. Secondly, if we're not getting that, or we have a administration that doesn't support that, we have the power to vote that out and to bring people in who are going to tell the truth at a local, state, and a federal level. But it is a controversial issue, and I think it's hard time. We're in a different time in our country, and these hard conversations we should not shy away from. Obviously appropriate and age appropriate as we bring it into our education system, but that's what education is. And I remember my college days too, having those hard conversations and learning so much from them, and it formed who we are. That's what we're talking about. So it shouldn't be, there are parties that try to make this very controversial and difficult. At its heart, it really isn't.
All right, thank you guys so much. I really do appreciate it. Thank you guys all for your time, Jay and Cynthia, Jerica and Greg. Great discussion, I think, and appreciate your answers to all the my questions as well as the attendees as well. And thanks again to Noble and the Williams. I think we are right on time. We're actually, it's a Zoom meeting that ends on time is always something to celebrate, right? We can all head off into the rest of our lives for the next Zoom meeting, probably in an hour or so. So yeah, thank you again to all the panelists, much appreciated, and thank you to all the attendees.
Waiting, I guess.